Oh, man. Oh, man. Oh, it's still going. Oh, my God. I can't believe. Oh, I can't believe it. That was so good. Alright folks, it is group 2 of my battery testing. Group 1 brought more contenders out of the woodwork, and we have got some really big names here. Some of the names you asked for, like Lumenier, Revolectric, Optipower, Tattu, Bonka. Got lots of graphenes as well. We're going to compare graphenes to LiPos and high volts. We're going to answer a lot of really pressing questions. Let's get into it. Before we dive into the results and the methodology and all that stuff that I love to talk about, and I know you love to hear, I do need to take a second and thank the people who submitted these batteries to me for testing. There's too many batteries out there for me to just go ahead and buy all the ones that we might want to test, especially since some of them turned out to be bad. Whoever sent me the Dinogy, sorry. Oh, you own a bad battery. It's not very good. I mean, it'll make your copter go, but not very good. Better you than me, my friend. Thank you so much. And I'm going to do a little roll of all their names, of all the people who submitted them down there at the bottom of the screen. And everyone thank them for their contributions to the channel. Before we get into the results, let me just tell you about my methodology quickly for those of you who didn't watch Group 1. And if you're familiar with my methodology, you can click the shortcut on screen to skip this section of the video. One of the tests I do is a discharge to 14 volts at 20 amps. I discharge to 14 volts because I feel like that's a good stopping point that would be indicative of where you would probably stop flying the battery if you were actually in the air. Now, some of you may run your batteries a little lower, a little higher, I don't know, but this is an apples-to-apples standard comparison to show us how these batteries stack up against each other. The 20 amp discharge rate is probably not as aggressive as most of you will be flying the batteries, and so what's the point of it? The point of the 20 amp discharge rate is to indicate whether the battery's rated capacity is correct. We expect to see these batteries typically getting between about 80 and 85% of their rated capacity at 20 amps of discharge. So if any battery does significantly worse than that, then we think that that battery is not rated accurately. And if any battery does significantly better than that, then that battery is exceptional in some way. We also have a 40 amp test that I usually do, where I discharge to 14 volts at 40 amps. I have not performed the 40 amp tests on this group of batteries because, well, the short version is that I had a business trip last week and I got a business trip this week, and I really want to get these results out. And so in order to get this video out, I said we're going to skip the middle ground. We're going to do the basic capacity baseline test, and then we're going to do the 60 amp test, which is where all the excitement really is. And together, I think those things still tell us which of these batteries is better and which of these batteries is worse. Now for the 60 amp test, you can't just discharge them to 14 volts and say how do they do, because they sag so much at 60 amps that as soon as you stop the test, they rebound and they're practically up at 16 volts again. They're practically almost fresh off the charger. So instead what we do is we repeatedly discharge them to 14 volts again and again until they're resting at 15 volts. Which is a good stop point in my opinion. And then we count the number of bursts that it took to get there, and we add up the total amount of time that the battery was discharging, and we do all the other metrics. Okay, so the 60 amp test is a little different. Actually, it's not quite 60 amps, it's closer to 58 amps, but anyway. Okay, so that's the methodology. One more thing to say, and that is that I have dropped the Lumenier 1000 milliamp hour battery out of the test. And the reason for that, this was submitted by a friend of mine from the local flight club, and it was an almost brand new battery, but he had flown it some. Now, he doesn't typically abuse his batteries, but the results on this battery were so bad that I said it's not fair if I'm not absolutely sure that this battery isn't factory fresh and has never been abused or over discharged or anything. It's not fair to show it performing really badly when there's such a potential flaw in my methodology. So when a battery gives decent results or good results, the fact that it's not brand new, well, that acts in its favor, saying even though it's not brand new, it's still doing okay. But in this case, the battery was doing really, really badly, and I didn't think it was fair to show it doing so badly if I knew that the battery wasn't brand new. I'm not gonna crucify this battery, especially because Lumenier batteries are usually pretty good. So the Lumenier 1000 milliamp hour is out of the test. The other thing I need to tell you about the test, as I said, I dropped out the 40 amp tests, but I actually did the 40 amp test for the Bolt 1000, and the reason for that, and again, I'm sloppy because I'm going on a business trip, I'm really rushed, but the reason for that is that I forgot to do the 20 amp test, and then I gave the battery back to its owner, so it's gone. I can't go do the 20 amp test. So instead, I had already run the 40 amp test for that one, so I've included the 40 amp results for the Bolt 1000, but not for any of the others. Okay. Let's get into the comparisons, the results, etc., 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 and see what's what. The first thing I did is I sorted these batteries by their weight. Now, of course, we've got the 1000 milliamp hour batteries, and they're very light. Fine, set them aside. And if we look at the weight of the 1300 milliamp hour batteries, we see some interesting things. First of all, the lightest ones are the Dinogy and the Optipower, coming in at 145, and then the Optipower, the Revolectrics, at 149 grams. But the Revolectrics is a 1500 milliamp hour, whereas the Optipower is only a 1300. Is the Revolectrics legitimately a 1500 milliamp hour for 149 grams? Well, if we look at the 20 amp discharge, we see that the Revolectrics gave 82% of its rated capacity, which is within the range of about 80 to 85% that we normally expect. So it feels like this is an honest milliamp hour rating. And I don't know how Revolectrics gets 1500 milliamp hours out of 149 grams, but that is a heck of a ratio of charge to weight. As we continue to go up, we see the batteries get heavier and heavier. We've got here the Bonka 1600, which is 161 grams, a little heavier there. Again, 1600 got 81% of its rated capacity, so basically accurate. Although many of the batteries did better in this test, many of the batteries did quite well and might actually, by this standard, be underrated. So, for example, here's a Lumenier 1300 that gave 88% of its rated capacity, and here's a Tattu 1300 that gave 90%, and the Optipower 1300 gave 90% of its rated capacity. Well, so by that respect, should we call that battery a 1500 at 78%? 1400 at 84%? So there's a little bit of wiggling going on here. Optipower rates this as a 1300, but they could, by Revolectric standards, rate it as a 1400. So I think one thing you can do here is pay attention to the milliamp hour that the battery delivered relative to its weight and find out, how much charge it's carrying per gram of weight. As we look at the 20 amp test, there's not a lot that really jumps out. If you want to split hairs, you can dig through these numbers and split some hairs. But I think the 60 amp tests are really where the batteries started to excel. If we look at the 60 amp tests, the relevant metric, the most relevant metric, I think, is the longest burst that the battery gave. So this is the longest time that it could sustain this 60 amp or 58 amp discharge. And that, I think, is a good indicator of a healthy high-performance battery. If we look, we can see that the Revolectrics 1500 held the 58 amp discharge for 24 seconds, was its longest burst, and a total time of 1 minute 6 seconds, 8 bursts. So it had relatively long bursts and the longest single burst in the test. The Lumenier 1300 came in second with a 17-second burst, only 7 bursts, and a total time of 56 seconds. Whereas if we compare that to a more sort of average normal battery, like for example here, this one is pretty good, this Bonka 1500 here, 7-second burst with 12 bursts, total time 58 seconds. So I think this is interesting because as you look through these numbers, many of the batteries come in around the time of, say, 55 seconds to 1 minute 5 seconds. But the batteries with the longest burst times are going to be the ones with less sag, longer sustained punch-outs, and just better overall performance. Now, there were some specific questions that people who sent batteries to me had that I want to address now. I think you're going to find them interesting. One of them was by Miguel Arredondo. He submitted the Bonka 1300 Graphene and the Bonka 1600 LiPo. This is a standard LiPo. Now the reason that we're going to compare these batteries is that they're almost the same size and weight, 161 grams versus 167 grams. So does the fact that the LiPo is a higher capacity and is therefore running at a lower C rating, 38C versus 46C, does that make up for the fact that it's not a graphene? Does the graphene give it that extra oomph? And I think we can see that the answer to that is probably yes. Notice that the graphene's longest burst was 10 seconds, whereas the 1600 standard LiPo only get a 6-second burst. Also notice that the standard LiPo took 20 bursts to get all the way down to 15.06, whereas the Bonka graphene had 8 bursts. It might seem like the one with more bursts was better, but actually no. Fewer longer bursts is better than more shorter bursts. And I think these two specs really show the graphene's advantage. When you're flying, you don't want a battery that is going to rebound and then sag immediately, and that's what we're looking at here. You want a battery that will continue to give sustained power, and that's what this is showing with this 8 bursts versus 20. Now, you could say that the 1600 did go slightly longer, actually more than slightly. It was 14 seconds longer, and it delivered more milliamp hours, 819 versus 960. So you could certainly ask the question of, if you're not doing big punches and hard accelerations, it's possible that you would get a slightly longer flight time out of the 1600 for the same amount of weight or slightly less weight. But for the kind of pilot who's doing strong punches and hard accelerations, the graphene is the one that I would pick. How does a high volt battery compare to a graphene battery? Let's take a look at that. Now, the only high volt in this test is the Revolectric's 1500 high volt. And that's going to be tough because it basically kicked the butt of every battery in the test. But the only battery that even came close was the Lumenier 1300 graphene, which is by all rights an amazing battery. If we compare those two batteries against each other, we can see that the Revolectric destroys the Lumenier. They both had close to the same discharge time, but the high volt had more milliamp hours, it had more time, it had a much longest burst. The only place where the Revolectrics did significantly worse than the Lumenier was in temperature. The Revolectrics was a whopping 142 degrees Fahrenheit at the end of the test, whereas the Lumenier was a relatively balmy 115. So people ask, well, which is better, high volt or graphene? And I think that as good as graphene is, it's only an enhancement to the existing LiPo chemistry, whereas high volt, you're just pumping some extra volts in there, and those extra volts translate to extra watts, and extra watts translates to more speed, more thrust. So I think in general, between a high volt and a high volt is going to win. Now, you could give me a bad high volt and a good graphene, and the graphene could beat it. But here we've got a great high volt and a great graphene, and the high volt still destroys the graphene, no matter how good the graphene is. So in answer to the question of high volt versus graphene, I feel like the answer is if you can fly high volts, go ahead. But if you're in some kind of a race league or something where they don't let you fly high volts, then something like this Lumenier 1300 graphene is certainly going to give you an edge. Now, if we compare the Lumenier 1300 graphene to the Turnigy 1300 graphene, these are very similar batteries in many ways, but the Turnigy is $26 and the Lumenier is $35. The Turnigy is also 177 grams versus 164 grams for the Lumenier. So it's a pretty substantial weight difference between them. And if we look at their performance, we can see that the Turnigy didn't do a terrible job. 9 to 52-second discharge time, 9-second longest pulse, etc., etc., etc. But the Lumenier was way better, and especially if you take into account the additional weight that you're carrying with the Turnigy, man, the Lumenier graphene really destroys it. So this is a case where, as much as I love to find bargains like this Revolectrics here, in this case, the extra money you're paying for the Lumenier over the Turnigy certainly seems to be paying off in terms of performance. Another question that people ask about graphenes is, the graphenes are pretty consistently heavier than an equivalent standard LiPo. So are the graphenes just like big batteries that have been derated? So you take a 1600 and you call it a 1300 graphene, and then it gives better performance because it seems like, because it's at a lower C rating effectively. So is it just all marketing hype? And I think the answer to that is no. If we look at the discharge amounts for these graphenes, we can see, for example, this Turnigy 1300 graphene discharged 83% of its rated capacity at 20 amps. This Bonka graphene, 84%. Okay, the Lumenier graphene, 88%. So the Lumenier may actually be a little derated. It may actually legitimately be a 1400, perhaps. But if we look at the weight, it doesn't have a ton of extra weight compared to, for example, the Tattu 1300. So if it is legitimately a 1400, they're packing it in there more densely somehow. So I don't think that the graphenes in general are dishonest about their rating. Another question that a viewer wanted to ask about was how the Tattu Race-Spec battery compared to the standard Tattu. So here's the standard Tattu 1300, and here's the Tattu Race-Spec 1300. Now the Race-Spec battery is a little heavier, and it's a little more expensive. Did it perform better? And the answer to that is surprisingly no, not really. A little maybe. We can see here that the standard Tattu gave 15 bursts, max of 5 seconds, and a total of 58 seconds, whereas the Race-Spec gave 12 bursts, so that's slightly better, max of 6 seconds, so that's slightly better, and a total of 51 seconds, so a little bit less discharge time, but I guess it's consistent for a battery that is designed for racing. It's not designed for endurance so much as it is for max amps. The Race-Spec battery also gave a smaller percentage of its rated capacity and surprisingly fewer watt hours. And watt hours is one of the things I really look at when I'm evaluating a battery. A battery that gives more watt hours will have delivered more power. Amps are all well and good, but power is what makes speed and thrust. So I would not say overall that the Tattu Race, it did a little better. So it's not just complete BS that they're charging $34 for the Race-Spec versus $30 for the standard, but it didn't blow away the standard one, at least not in this testing. Another question that I wanted to answer in this testing is, how does the Bolt 1000 milliamp hour battery compare to a standard 1300 LiPo? The guy who donated these batteries to me for the testing said one of the ideas he had was that instead of running 1300 LiPos, he would run 1000 milliamp hour high volts, and he would get a lighter battery, but with an equivalent amount of performance. And that does not seem to hold up. Now, if we look at the Bolt 1000, we can see that in the 60 amp discharge test, the max was 8 seconds, and that's actually longer than some of the standard LiPos. In fact, many of the standard LiPos didn't hit that mark. Okay, but the total discharge time was only 46 seconds. The milliamp hours was 704, which, by the way, that's a perfectly respectable 70% of the rated capacity. That's actually awesome for the 60 amp discharge. But it doesn't really get you into the range of what any of the standard LiPos or the graphenes are doing, which are giving closer in the range of 800 to 900 milliamp hours and closer in the range of, say, 55 to 1 minute and 5 seconds. I can tell you subjectively that I actually flew this battery this afternoon. I was out flying and I just grabbed it out of the pack, and I got about 2 minutes flight time off of it, whereas I typically get between 3 and 3 minutes and a half off of a 1300 standard. So the Bolt 1000 does not substitute for a 1300, although it is really nice to fly. That extra 30 grams, let's say, you certainly can feel it. You might say, well, can you really feel 30 grams? You can. The copter is noticeably sort of lighter, more responsive, and corners better. Whereas you put this Turnigy on there and it is noticeably corners worse. So you definitely can feel the difference. If you had short races, this battery might do the trick. This battery did not do so bad. An 8-second burst at 60C is actually pretty darn impressive. These batteries, many of them struggled to do an 8-second burst even at a relatively low 40 to 45C. So this is a great battery, especially at the price. And if you've got a race that is going to last less than 2 minutes, it certainly is worth considering. I've often said that I think that internal resistance is a good indicator of a battery's overall performance, but I've got to tell you that these results have me questioning that. Maybe it's just that my method of measuring internal resistance isn't very accurate. There are some indicators. For example, the Dinogy has 45 milliohms of internal resistance, which is the most of any battery, and it performed the worst. However, the Revolectrics came in at 30 milliohms, which is not exceptionally low, but it performed fantastically. Maybe this measurement was an anomaly. If we look at the Lumenier 1300, we had 19 milliohms. That's one of the best numbers, and it's one of the best performing batteries. Meanwhile, we've got the Turnigy 1300 milliamp hour Graphene with 20 milliohms, almost the same as the Lumenier, but nowhere near the same performance. So I think that's the best indicator I could have, that my rule of thumb that internal resistance is the best indicator and the best single indicator of battery performance. That rule of thumb is not completely correct. There's something else going on here. The fact that we can have such varying performance between the Turnigy 1300 Graphene with 20 milliohms and the Lumenier 1300 Graphene with 19 milliohms, almost the same, and yet the Lumenier got a 24-second pulse and the Turnigy got something like an 8-second pulse. Not a fantastic result. There's one more thing that I want to say before we finish up the results of this testing, and that is that, the Revolectrics did very well in this testing. If you go back to Group 1, you can see that the performance of the Bolt 1300 high volt was very similar. The weight is very similar, and the price is very similar. So let's not forget the Bolt 1300. Both it and the Revolectrics really seem like rock stars if you want to run high volt batteries. And that is going to bring us to the end of this test. We've tested the batteries. And I think that a thing we could take from this test is that there's a wide middle ground where many batteries are pretty decent. Any of these Bonkas or Tattus, you'll be perfectly happy to fly them. But some batteries are very, very good, and some batteries are even very good while being not too expensive. Other batteries are very bad. And that's the value of testing like this, is to find the batteries that are not worth buying and the batteries that are real diamonds in the rough. Hope you've enjoyed this testing. We'll be rounding up another round at some point in the future, but for the time being, I'm ready to do something other than battery testing. Maybe actually get out and fly once in a while. So I'm not gonna do another round of battery testing for a little while. I'll make an announcement when I'm ready. And in the meantime, happy flying.